let's call it the grand bargain. My view would be that we'll have failed at the assignment if government has to build another pipeline. The reason we have to have a fast track is because we know that there are barriers. And so if we can kickstart it and have a dual track, I think that we may be able to achieve the outcome. We'll know in a couple of months' time.
Mark Carney met with the premiers today at a National First Ministers meeting. Danielle Smith came to play for the interests of Albertans, but also, as it turns out, the rest of Canadians as well. She didn't make Mark Carney an offer he wouldn't refuse, but in the words of Don Corleone, she made him an offer that he couldn't refuse. Let's take a look.
We're also focused on building nation-building projects, and that took up much of our discussion today. I outlined during the meetings the central contribution of the federal government to this mission, first and foremost to eliminate all remaining federal barriers to internal trade and labor mobility, and to enable the federal government, working with the provinces, the territories, Indigenous peoples, to identify and expedite nation-building projects. To be deemed in the national interest, those projects should, amongst others, strengthen the Canadian economy, strengthen our autonomy, our resilience, and our security, provide undeniable benefits to Canada, have a high likelihood of successful execution, be a high priority for Indigenous leaders, and to drive Canada's clean growth potential. Under a new process, once a project is designated as being in the country's national interest, a new federal major project office will bring together all relevant federal departments to provide a single set of conditions that must be met for those projects to advance. And the commitment is to proceed with the approval process for a maximum of 2 years under a new streamlined process that prioritizes federal resources to these most important projects. We will also work towards one project, one review, including through new cooperation agreements with the provinces.
Okay, so there's some good and not so good off the hop here. Number one, he's still talking about these national projects, nation building projects. What are they? We don't know. Number two, he says that they're going to set up yet another office, because that's what the government needs, is another office. Because there's no other office that could actually, look at this, right? They need another one. No doubt they're going to have to hire people as new public servants in order to work in this office, in order to execute this. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean like in an office building, but in a agency. So we'll see how this plays out. But that doesn't get me excited. The other thing that doesn't get me excited is he says, well, we want to approve things inside of 2 years. 2 years? You're going to have a dedicated office, and you're going to improve things within 2 years. And he says, well, and to be clear, that's a maximum of 2 years. Meanwhile, Pierre Poilievre is saying 6 months. Let's get it done. 6 months. But it's something, I guess. It's something. So, and they have all this criteria of what would be a project in the national interest. So, so already there's some good and bad. The good is that he's saying one project, one review. That means you don't have to go through 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different review boards to actually get a project done. Let's see if that actually happens. Again, Bill C-69 is a big problem for this. Anyway, when you say one project, one review, reviewed by who? Because it has to be reviewed by Indigenous people and the leaders in the region. Has to be reviewed by the provinces, according to you. Has to be reviewed by the federal government. Has to be reviewed by the environmentalists. So what exactly do you mean by one project, one review? Unless all of those different groups are going to be present at, one review board. Don't know. We need some more details here. But if that's actually the case, if it's one project, one review, that's a step in the right direction in terms of the massive amount of bureaucracy that it has a chokehold in these types of things. So we'll see. Let's continue.
The point is to build the certainty, the stability, and the ambition that builders need to catalyze enormous investment to make Canada into an energy superpower, and to build the strongest economy in the G7. We had wide-ranging discussions. There was a lot of preparation for this meeting. We discussed a wide range of potential nation-building projects, including, and this is far from exhaustive, the Western and Arctic Corridor, which, amongst other things, connects energy, critical minerals, and trade infrastructure, the Eastern Energy Partnership, critical minerals pathways, which include a range of critical mineral projects that premiers can speak to, the next stage of nuclear, from uranium to SMRs to large-scale nuclear, and a series of infrastructure investments for export diversification from ports to rails to last-mile roads. All First Ministers agreed that Indigenous partnerships and equity will be central to success. And upcoming federal legislation will mandate both meaningful consultation with Indigenous peoples, both during the process of determining which projects are in the national interest and developing the conditions for each project. The goal here is to get projects built faster so we can create more high-paying careers and greater prosperity for all Canadians.
This sounds a lot like Pierre's plan, doesn't it? Well, if it gets done and it's good for Canadians, then so what, right? But we'll see. He said something critical there. Well, so the Indigenous communities need to be a part of the consultation process of literally everything. So what happens if you can't get a single nation building project approved because all of the Indigenous communities say no? What are you going to do, Carney? Now, this isn't me blaming the Indigenous communities. This is me saying Carney has put a very specific clause in this. So what happens if you can't get anything done? You're going to be a lame duck prime minister that is sitting there promising the world, and Santa shows up without toys in his sack. That's what you're going to be. And you're going to go from hero to zero in even the Liberal eyes right quick.
Premier Smith, perhaps you'd like to respond. If I'm understanding correctly, Prime Minister, you are saying that you would fast track a project involving decarbonized oil through pipelines, decarbonized energy. And is that something that, Premier Smith, that you agree with, or do you feel that we need to get the bitumen out of the ground now as is, as soon as possible?
Well, let's call it the grand bargain, that we know that there is a group of oil sands companies that have been advocating for some time for what they call the Pathways Project that would decarbonize the production of their bitumen through the use of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, ultimately using a hydroelectric or small modular nuclear to decarbonize, and then direct air capture for the last mile. I think the point I was making to the Prime Minister and my colleagues is that there's lots of ways to decarbonize, but the Pathways project is an expensive project. It would cost anywhere from $10 to $20 billion to get built. And to make the economic case for that, having more egress with more barrels to be sold to Asia is the way to pay for it. If we had a 1 million barrel a day pipeline going to the Northwest BC coast, that would generate about $20 billion a year in revenues. And so that seems like a pretty good value proposition if both of those projects can proceed at once.
Ladies and gentlemen, checkmate. Now, what do I mean by that? It's a brilliant play by Danielle Smith. So she knows that Mark Carney and the Liberals are climate fiends, right? They will go to the nth degree over and above what is reasonable to most Canadians in order to make themselves feel good about what they're doing for the planet. Mark Carney has been advocating for this in the financial sector for a decade or more. We heard about that from our interview with Desiree Fixler. So what is she doing here? Well, because she understands that, she's making the play like this. She's saying, listen, Carney, you want to do all this decarbonization stuff. You want to do all this environmental stuff. You want to do all this energy transition. Fine. But guess what? That's expensive, isn't it? And you don't have the money to do this. But guess where that money is? It's in the ground in our natural resources. And our oil companies have already been advocating for this decarbonization initiative, which Mark Carney is saying is required in order to justify building pipelines. Well, they're saying that's what we want to do, but it's going to cost $20 billion. So in order to pay for that, we need a pipeline. You get us a pipeline, we'll be able to pay for that in a year. 1 year. So you give us that pipeline, and that Alberta oil is going to pay for that same decarbonization project that Alberta has been putting forth. And there's a lot more in the ground in Alberta that can pay for a lot of other things. So this is where she has him in a corner, because she's saying, you can't do your environmental stuff without money. And we can't get money without pipelines. So if you give us a pipeline, we're going to be able to start paying for a lot of environmental stuff. It's not going to happen by 2030. You're dreaming, buddy. She's saying 2050. And she's even including small modular nuclear reactors. When you see SMR anywhere, that's what that means. Small modular reactors. Again, we have some of the best nuclear engineers in the world. Let's use them. So very, very interesting play by Danielle Smith. And here's the problem. Because the logic is so sound and the balance sheet behind it is so sound, even the banker cannot argue with it. Not at all.
Judy Trin, CTV News. Prime Minister, other than the premiers of BC and Quebec, there seems to be growing consensus in support of pipelines carrying bitumen east, west, probably north as well. Is the federal government at this point considering pipelines a project of national significance, and will you be sidestepping certain environmental requirements outlined in Bill C-69 to fast track such a project?
Well, the first thing to say is, and let me be a bit more specific if I could, because and I will defer to the premiers to add, but the Western premiers and the premiers of the territories met and supported an approach. The Western corridor, the Western and Arctic corridor, effectively a corridor between port to port to port, from Pacific Northwest to James Bay to Grays Bay Point, and within that are opportunities in energy, critical minerals, and well beyond. And specifically within energy, opportunities, yes, for an oil pipeline to get to Tidewater. Now, within the broader context of national interest, the interest is in, as mentioned in the press release, decarbonized barrels. So working alongside forms of decarbonization for those barrels. That is absolutely in our interest. It provides diversification of trade partners. It provides the development of new industries. It provides economic activity across the West and into the North. So yes, there's real potential there. We took up a good deal of our time in discussions and potential to move forward on that. And if further developed, the federal government will look to advance it.
And there it is, folks. Now, what does he mean by decarbonized barrels? When I first heard this term, decarbonized oil, it was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. So it's essentially a buzzword, and what that means is you're reducing you're reducing the quote unquote carbon that is expelled or burned getting the oil out of the ground. That's all that means. It doesn't mean that, you know, it's it's like a thinner oil. It doesn't mean, you know, it's like low fat oil or anything like that. The oil is the exact same as it would have been. It's just the process to get it out of the ground and actually get it to the point where it's in said pipeline and moving it along. It's quote unquote lower carbon emission. That's what that means. So this is where Danielle Smith has them. She says, well, you know, we have these companies, they want to proceed with this decarbonized oil initiative, but they can't do that until they get the revenue. And the revenue is in that pipeline, in that energy corridor that they want to export out west. So this is where he could not, because Danielle Smith came in and literally satisfied every single requirement. So he could not say, well, no, we're not going to do that. And he had to say, yeah, that's something that we have to consider. Now, did he say yes? No. But the problem is he can't say no. He can't say no, otherwise all of this whole meeting is a complete waste of time, and he's going to have all premiers, even Doug Ford, because Doug Ford's going to go, he's going to have to follow the rest of them. All those premiers are immediately going to call BS on him, and then you're going to see the fastest fall of a prime minister we've ever seen in this country. So we'll see what happens. But this is where he admits that she's right.
There are differences of opinion around the table as to whether an oil pipeline should be a candidate to be fast-tracked without a proponent pitching one. Prime Minister, can you clarify, is the federal government prepared to say it's willing to fast-track an oil pipeline without a private sector proponent saying it wants to build one?
Look, it's not a decision. It's not a decision we have to make today. I think what's clear, be absolutely clear. We're saying, and this is consistent. This is consistent with the agreement we had as First Ministers back in March when we met in Ottawa, when we talked about energy and trade corridors. It had a little less focus because we hadn't translated that into a legislative initiative and more specifics about projects. There is an ability to build that energy infrastructure, that oil pipeline. I'm going to refer to my earlier answer and to Premier Smith's answer moments ago about a grand bargain, decarbonizing the barrels, various ways to do that. I agree with her, and so the opportunity is there. The market is there in Asia. It is within, last point, it is within a bigger framework that the Western premiers and the territorial premiers have come up with, which is the Western Arctic corridor. So it's much more than that. And sometimes the discussion is reduced far too much to one type of project. It's important, but the range of what we're discussing is much, much bigger than that. And if I can just finish with this is the point for the country. Our ambitions must be bigger and broader. And what we heard today, what we discussed today, was entirely consistent with that. Big, broad ambitions, consistent with having the strongest economy in the G7 and being an energy superpower. Thank you.
We'll have time.
And what I heard from the Prime Minister is that, I mean, it's up to us to find the proponent, I think. I think if there's some certainty that a process is going to be successful in a reasonable period of time, a 2-year window, I think that there will be a proponent that will step forward. My view would be that we'll have failed at the assignment if government has to build another pipeline. That will demonstrate to us that we didn't create the conditions for private investment to come to the table. So I'm encouraged that the Prime Minister is prepared to do a 2-track process. Let's identify a project and a window and work towards identifying the ways, some of the barriers that have been in the way of the current regulatory process, at the same time as working on fixing the regulatory process so that it makes future projects easier to approve. I think the reason we have to have a fast track is because we know that there are barriers. And so if we can kickstart it and have a dual track, I think that we may be able to achieve the outcome. We'll know in a couple of months' time, hopefully, whether this new approach is going to work, but I think it's worth giving it a try.
Did you catch that look from Danielle Smith over at Mark Carney? She undercut him right there, and it was an interesting dance that she did there. So Carney's saying, oh, we're consistent, and we need to think bigger, and we're going to have the strongest economy in G7. It's not just pipelines, and we need to be thinking about all those. Fine. And then Danielle Smith was like, well, yeah, I agree with Mark Carney when he said this, and I'm glad to see that he's going to do this, which is essentially prescribing for everybody in the media. This is what he said. This is what our expectations are. This is what our understanding is as premiers. And then she says, and we'll know in a few months whether this is successful. Basically saying, we're going to be watching to see if you actually follow up on what you said you're going to do. You made these commitments. Are you going to meet them? And this is what I said before. If he doesn't, this happy meeting with the premiers is going to be a very different shade in a couple of months, because they're going to say, listen, you're the one saying let's move fast. Well, let's move fast. It's your regulatory bodies that are going to be holding this stuff up. So she's saying that's good to see that you want to fix them, and also look at the projects. Not let's take 4 years and fix the regulatory process and then start looking at projects. Makes sense to do them both at the same time. Why not? Get it in the hopper. Makes sense. So that was really interesting that she kind of put him on notice at the end there. Very clever. And the other thing that I'll say is when she said that if we have to have a government-built pipeline, then this will be a failure. And I agree for many, many reasons. Number one, government projects of this magnitude will always go over budget, in some cases by a factor of 2, maybe more. And why is that? Because the government is absolutely terrible at understanding how much things cost. And when there are cost overruns, because they can just print money, they don't seem to care. But if the goal here is to have a private firm, a private investor build this pipeline, then that's a different story, because they're going to be interested in keeping the cost down. They're going to be interested in getting this done quickly, because the faster they get it done, the faster they start getting revenue, and the faster they start getting that return on their investment. So again, sounds like Pierre Poilievre's plan, doesn't it? Make things very, very attractive for developers, and make things very attractive for investment, so that they're clamoring to actually get in and engage in these projects. That's what you want. So, very interesting poker in play in this. Now, the other interesting thing to note is Scott Moe obviously was in support of what Danielle Smith was saying. Ford had agreed with Danielle Smith. Again, he has to. And even Wab Kinew had supported Danielle Smith throughout the day, from what we've heard on these initiatives. So you have an NDP and 3 conservative premiers all in agreement that this is what we need to do. And you even had the new Liberal premier of New Brunswick chiming in and saying, we're in agreement with the Arctic Corridor and the Western Corridor. So they're in agreement with all this. So you have Liberal, NDP, and Conservative all agreeing and telling Mark Carney, we need energy pipelines. It's a fact. If you want to talk about being any type of energy superpower, our oil and gas needs to be at the center of it. And that oil and gas, you can use that economic powerhouse to then fund a lot of this other stuff, to look at a mass rollout of small nuclear reactors, to look at big nuclear reactors in some of the core epicenters around the country. You can fund a whole bunch of things like that. But this just comes back to the main core premise of Trudeau and Guilbeault and their whole climate ridiculousness, is that you cannot just flip a switch and say, all right, we're not using oil and gas anymore. We're using green energy in technology that doesn't make sense. They keep talking about renewables. They should talk to the people that actually run the power grids and ask them how they feel about renewables. Spoiler alert, it's a pain in the ass for them because it's not consistent. And when you're dealing with an electric grid, it's a balancing act. You're regulating it. So when you have renewables that are solar and wind that are not consistent, it's a pain in the ass to actually balance that in the grid. But when you have consistency like hydro, like nuclear reactors, and other things like that, it's a lot easier. Gas plant is really no different than a nuclear plant. It generates a constant rate of electricity that filters in the grid and can be regulated. So, very interesting output of the Premier's meeting. Everyone sounded optimistic, but they all are basically looking at Mark Carney and saying, okay, we'll see. Even Ford said, Mark Carney is like Santa Claus with his bag of toys. And we're basically telling him what we want, and he has to go back to Ottawa and make it happen. Well, this is where it comes down to. All these premiers are saying, all right, you're saying you're going to deliver. You're saying you're going to get this regulation stuff under control. You're saying you're going to help greenlight some of this stuff. Although we're in Canada, feels like we're in Missouri, the show me state. And Mark Carney has a lot of show and tell to do in a matter of months.